Assalamu alaikum students. This is lecture number 25 and it's about Wordsworth Preface to Lyrical Ballads. In Preface to Lyrical Ballad, what he says about uh, poetry and what he says about poet and how does he tell us about the superiority of poetry and how does he prove the superiority of poetry over other branches of knowledge. This is what we will discuss, or these are the things which we will discuss in today's lecture. It is the last lecture of Preface to Lyrical Ballads. So, what is poetry and poet according to Wordsworth? And of course, the function of poetry as well, and superiority of poetry over other branches of knowledge. As we have discussed in previous lectures, that romantic poetry, romantic movement, is a reaction against the neoclassical era. Neoclassical era is the longest, as I told you, was the longest or is the longest era in the history of English literature, which began with Dryden and ends with the death of Johnson. It is called the era of satire. In this particular era, there was more focus on form and style. They were focusing on city life. They were focusing on artificial language rules, and they were bound to follow rules. They were using only 1 meter, and that was heroic couplet. So romantic writers reacted against them, and amongst romantic writers, Wordsworth is the one who was very active, and with the publication of Lyrical Ballads in 1798, romantic movement properly began. And it lasted for 30 or 32 years, but it was very interesting and, of course, very exuberant. There were poets who were writing their poetry, and they were deriving their material from nature. They were using imagination, feelings, emotions. We have some big names like Wordsworth's name himself. Then we have John Keats, William Blake, Shelley, Byron, Coleridge, who has given a concept of imagination and fancy, who has differentiated between imagination and fancy. So these are the great names we can find in the romantic movement. Okay, according to Wordsworth, poetry is the breath and final spirit of all knowledge. He says that the poet has a higher sensibility than other men. Higher sensibility means he feels more than other. He feels more than other ordinary people. He sees more than ordinary people. So he has higher sensibility than other or ordinary people. That is why the truth which he discovers is charged with heightened feeling and emotion. According to Wordsworth, poetry is the breath and final spirit of all knowledge. It is the impatient expression which is in the countenance of all science. It is something that is found in the countenance of all sciences or all science. Wordsworth says that the poet talks of universal truth and basic laws of human existence. Remember, the poet talks of universal truth and basic laws of human existence and nature in his poetry. And this can be shared by all. It's not like this that you can share the message of poetry or whatever written poetry with few people or few specific people. No, you can share it with all, every person, whether the person is educated, uneducated, or less educated, whether a person is religious bent of mind, worldly person, secular, with all you can share this message. This is the beauty of a poet. and poetry. That's why he says that a poet looks before and after. A poet looks before and after. The poetic truth involves the prominent feelings of the human heart. Remember, the poetic truth involves the permanent feelings of the human heart. The poet upholds love and binds human society. The poet upholds love and binds human society. Just we have one example when a song is played, so we all listen to the songs very cheerfully. Similarly, when national anthem is played, so we all listen to it and we stand up in respect for the anthem. In religious domain, we have naat, elegies, hymns. So we when we listen to them, so we definitely feel pleasure. His appeal, therefore, is to the intellect as well as to the heart of man. That is why the poet appeals. Not only he appeals to the intellect, but also to the heart of a man. Unlike the appeal of the scientist truth. But if we compare the appeal of a scientist truth, so we can find that it is only to the intellect one. It is only to those who are intellectual. And that is why he said that poetry is the first and last of all knowledge. Poetry is the first and last of all knowledge. It is as immortal as the heart of man. And that is why Wordsworth said that poetry is the first and last of all knowledge, and it is as immortal as the heart of man. So, any problem? If you have any problem, you can ask me. Wordsworth, when Wordsworth compared poetry with other branches of knowledge, so he said that poetry is superior to science. What he said about this, he says a scientist works hard to find out truth. He works hard to discover truths, and he finds pleasure in the discovery of these truths. But the truths he discovers, but the truths he discovers are of a particular and personal kind. It is the truths he discovers are of a particular and personal kind. The knowledge of both scientist and poet gives each pleasure, but in both cases knowledge is different. दोनों ही सूरत में knowledge जो है different है. The scientific man's knowledge is of a particular kind, whereas the poet gains knowledge which cleaves to us as a necessary part of our existence. So scientist's knowledge is of a particular kind, whereas the knowledge of poet which poet gains is of general. The poet's truth of knowledge is universal. This is something that is felt everywhere in the world. So Wordsworth says that the time may come when science would change and alter the very material conditions of life. And when this happens, poetry will play a useful part, useful role. According to Wordsworth, the poet will give feeling and emotional coloring to the factual achievement of science, and present it will present it in a very clear form to the reader. The dry substance of or subject of a scientific truth would be given life and vividness, flesh and blood, through the art of the poet. So the remotest discoveries of scientific men will be as proper to the poet's art as any other. So that is why he said that a scientist labors hard to discover truth. He finds pleasure in the discovery of these truths, but the truths which he discovers are of a particular and personal type. The knowledge of both scientist and poet gives each pleasure, but the knowledge in both cases is quite different. The scientific means the scientist is the knowledge of scientists is a the knowledge which scientists can is of particular kind. It is a truth which cannot be shared by all humanity. It is a truth which cannot be shared by all humanity, and the pleasure from such knowledge is confirmed to the scientist alone. ये साइंटिस्ट तक ही महदूद रहता है और साइंटिस्ट ही इसको कंफर्म करता है और चंद स्पेसिफिक लोग होंगे. He enjoys it in solitude. According to Wordsworth, the scientist enjoys it in solitude, अकेले में. The poet, on the other hand, gains knowledge which cleaves to us as a necessary part of our existence. Poetic truth can be shared by all humanity. It is derived from the basic principles of life. From the basic principles of life. It is from a perception of the unity of nature and man. The poet's truth of knowledge is universal. Remember, the poet's truth or knowledge is universal. In other words, we can say a poet sings a song in which when a poet sings a song, all humanity shares it. And that's why he says that poetry is superior to science. Wordsworth says that poetry is restricted to the individual field and deals with particularities. The poet delivers, or he delves into deep into the core of reality. He reaches far beneath the surface appearances to the permanent soul of things. Wordsworth said that poetry deals with the universal. Now, what does it mean? It means that according to Wordsworth, poetry is the image of man in nature. The subject of poetry is general and operative truth. Poetry is the man, as I told you, poetry is the image of man and nature. And the aim of poetry is to be true to nature. There are a number of hurdles and obstacles in the way of a historian, but the poet faces only one obstacle, and this is what? The necessity of giving immediate pleasure. Poet को फौरन से pleasure देना होता है. This is the only hurdle that a poet faces, but according to Wordsworth, in the way of a historian, there are many hurdles and obstacles. So poetry is a means by which truth about human nature can be carried alive into the heart by patient. Poetry is most philosophical. It is a poetry is most philosophical form of writing. This is also what we learn from Wordsworth's Preface to Lyrical Ballad. Now, there are some critics who says or who suggest that it's not possible or it's impossible for a poet to produce language that is fit or that is fit for passion is that which the real passion itself suggests. यानी कि ऐसी कोई लैंग्वेज को प्रोड्यूस करा जो कि पेशन इंसान के जज्बात को सही मानों में बता सके. So he should consider himself in the position of a translator who substitutes excellences of another kind to compensate for those which are unattainable by him. जैसे हम ट्रांसलेशन कर रहे होते हैं तो उसमें हमें कुछ ऐसे जुमले टारगेट लैंग्वेज में कन्वर्ट करने होते हैं जो बहुत मुश्किल होते हैं, इट इज़ वेरी डिफिकल्ट टू कन्वे द सेम मीनिंग फ्रॉम द सोर्स टेक्स्ट टू द टारगेट लैंग्वेज, बहुत मुश्किल होता है। और वी कैन नॉट कन्वे 100% दैट सेंस एंड मीनिंग जो हमारे पास सोर्स होता है उससे टारगेट लैंग्वेज में। सो ट्रांसलेटर की एग्जांपल दी गई है कि वो ब्यूटीफाई कर रहा होता है इन डिफरेंट एंड वे। फॉर एग्जांपल देर आर मेनी idioms in Urdu which we cannot translate into English. So what do? We translate its or their you know gist or their main ideas. Wordsworth. So Wordsworth said that the poet should beautify his poetry in his own manner. Wordsworth does not agree with his this view. He is of the opinion that such views are prompted by an improper understanding of the real nature of poetry. So he said it is only people who consider poetry to be short-lived and idle amusement who subscribe to such views, जो किस तरह के views को subscribe को मानते हैं वही इस poetry को ऐसे समझते हैं. The pleasure of poetry is much higher than such people feel or they consider. So poetry, according to Wordsworth, is the most philosophical of all writings. History deals with particular facts and philosophy with abstract truths. So poetry deals with both kinds of truth, particular as well as general. Wordsworth agrees with Aristotle's view that poetic truth is a much higher truth than historical truth or even scientific truth. Poetry is the most philosophical of all writings. History deals with particular facts and philosophy with abstract truth. Poetry deals with both kinds of truths, particular as well as general. Poetry is a source of poetic pleasure. Poetry is also a source of poetic pleasure. Poetry, according to Wordsworth, should give instant pleasure. It should not be considered as a degradation of the poet's art. इसका मतलब ये नहीं कि आप ये कंसिडर करना कि आप पोइट्स जो है उसकी जो है कितना खास नहीं है. इट इज़ इंडीड एन एक्नॉलेजमेंट ऑफ द ब्यूटी ऑफ द यूनिवर्स. The poet studies the elemental instincts of man and his natural impulses. He sees man in ordinary life. It is an act of a poet or the act of a poet who looks upon the world in a spirit of love. Pleasure is the grand elementary principle by which man knows, feels, lives, and moves. Pleasure is the grand it is the main elementary principle by which man knows, feels, lives, and moves. He considers man and the objects surrounding him as acting and reacting each other against each other. Through his sympathy with the objects of nature, he achieves knowledge or he gains knowledge, which ultimately results in an overbalance of pleasure. The poet has a perception of an organic unity in nature and man. There is a sense of oneness between, according to Wordsworth, there is a sense of oneness between nature and man. They both are, according to Wordsworth, are one. He says that the poet realizes this truth that man's mind is a mirror to the beauty of nature. यानी वो ये समझता है कि जो है इंसान पोइट रियलाइज करता है कि मैं इंसान का जो दिमाग है वो एक मिरर है जिसके ज़रिए आप ब्यूटी ऑफ नेचर को देख सकते हैं. The realization of this kind or such thing, a universe of this kind of universal truth gives him pleasure, and this is something that gives a poet pleasure. So those were the views of Wordsworth about poetic pleasure and how he proved superiority of poetry of other branches of knowledge like science, history, and even philosophy. I hope you must have bought the book. आप लोगों ने किताब खरीद ली होगी and you must have studied the book as well. पढ़ा भी होगा आप लोगों ने, okay? And these lectures will definitely पढ़ भी रहे होंगे आप, and these lectures will inshallah help you out. So this is the last lecture of the Preface to Lyrical Ballads, and after this inshallah I'll start um, Coleridge Biographia Literaria. So I will also send you some images of from the book of the text, pages of the text for your help. Now the last thing that we have to discuss here is what Wordsworth says about a poet. So when he answers to this question, what is a poet? So he says, and this is a very important part of paraphrase that we can get from the paraphrase. What is a poet? So his definitely concept is romantic concept. He said that a poet is a man speaking to men. It means that a poet is a common man. He is not a specific man, or he is not different from others, as can be seen with the new classical writers that they were different from ordinary people. And that is why ordinary people used to face great difficulties and problems when they were reading the literature or when they were reading the poems of the poets. So Wordsworth says that a poet is a man speaking to men. Wordsworth considered that a poet is to whom he addresses himself and what language is used by him. So he considered all these things. He says, firstly, a poet is a man speaking to men. He writes not only for his own pleasure but also for uh, communicating his emotions and feelings to others. Means he not only writes for his own pleasure but for the pleasure of other people as well. That is why, or for this reason, we can see that according to Wordsworth's conception of a poet, the poet has a social function. The poet performs a social function. A poet is different from other men because he has a more lively sensibility. He has more lively sensibility. That's why he is different from other. Now what does it mean, sensibility? Sensibility means he feels and sees and uh, hears more than ordinary people. So his sensibility is more lively than ordinary people. A poet is also different from other men because he has definitely his reactions to outside impressions are stronger, and so his emotions and passions are more enthusiastic, more tender, and more powerful. A poet has a greater degree of imaginative power than other men. He has a greater degree of imaginative power. He imagines more. He sees more. He even sees those which are hidden from ordinary people. When a poet sees something Romantic poet sees some object, so he will tell us more about that object than an ordinary person through his senses, and as a result, he can more vividly react emotionally even to events which he does not himself experience. Without any having any experience, he can react strongly. A poet is capable of being affected by absent things as they were present. He has the ability to conjure up in himself passions which are indeed far from being the same as those produced by real events. A poet has a greater knowledge of human nature. This is what I would like to tell you. That according to Wordsworth, a poet has a greater knowledge. A poet has greater knowledge of human nature, and this is something that has differentiated the plays of Shakespeare with other plays of other playwrights. Shakespeare's plays are very famous all over the world, and they are getting more and more famous across the world globe. Why? Because he was a great he had a great knowledge of human nature. He was a great observer of human nature, and the way he observed human nature in his plays are exceptionally remarkable. So Wordsworth has a great knowledge of human nature, and that is why he is able to understand patients even if he has not directly experienced them. यानी कि अगर directly उनके साथ खुद नहीं भी हुआ, उसके बावजूद he is able to understand the patient. Wordsworth says that he has also a more comprehensive soul. He can identify himself with the emotions of others. He can identify himself with the emotions of others and express these emotions easily. A poet, according to Wordsworth, again, according to Wordsworth, a poet has a more comprehensive soul. He can identify himself with the emotions of others and express these emotions easily. A poet takes pleasure in communicating his sense of joy to others. According to Wordsworth, the poet writes of emotions which his characters are supposed to have experienced. Therefore, the passions which he communicates are mere shadows. He says that the purpose of poetry is to give pleasure, and the poet is no longer a social instrument but an individual pleased with his own passions and volitions. The poet should try to identify himself emotionally with the character whose feelings he is conveying. He should convey the feelings in a language which would be or should be used by the characters in real life. The identification can be achieved through imaginative powers and high, heightened sensibility. Wordsworth says that the poet is not a mere copier or imitator. He's not only a copier or imitator, but he is a creator. And sensibility is something that becomes more important than rationality for him. And rationality is something that was more important for the new classical writers. And with romantic writers, sensibility is more, it becomes more important. When talking about the qualifications of the poet, so Wordsworth says that the poet, the poet must have certain gifts which are not common among mankind. And this idea would soon or will soon lead to the conception of the poet as a genius, and eventually critics will want the poet to be not merely a superior man speaking to men. but a superior man is speaking only to superior men. So, in short, we can say uh, that Wordsworth has given a new definition to poetry. Before this, the poetry was totally different, but now the poetry is become totally different. It deals with emotions, feelings, with the rustic life, the language of rustic people. It deals with nature. You'll find nature, imagination, and all such things now in this kind of poetry. Enthusiasm, patience are the characteristics of this kind of literature or poetry. Before this, as I told you, that the poetry was lacking different, was totally lacking. The poetry was totally lacking feelings and emotions, and the subject matter was also artificial. Their poetry was confined to certain individuals, or they were confined to city life, and they were bound by the rules. But here the poetry is not confined to rules and regulations, and it's not confined, it is something that expresses human the thing feelings which are in the heart of humans. It is some in this kind of literature, you will find that there was an experiment of different types of meters you can find here. They are not bound by only heroic couplet, but they can use any type of meter. So this is also called the revival of meters. The writers were busy paying more attention to the style than the subject matter in the previous era, but now they are busy and they are paying attention to the style. Remember, romantic writers, according to Wordsworth, romantic writers were dissatisfied soul. Why? Because they had too many things to do, and that is why they were not being satisfied. In fact, Wordsworth started a new era in the history of English literature, and that lasted for almost 30 or 32 years, and it has its great impact upon English literature. So, if you have any questions, you can ask me. I'm giving you some time. So, if you have any questions regarding whatever we have done, so you can ask me. Remember, this is the last lecture of the Preface to Lyrical Ballads, and one question will be given to you from this critic. It is probably the most important critic if you talk about romantic movement. He will also study college who belongs to this era. So before studying college, definitely Wordsworth is very important because he's telling us what romantic poetry is all about. Thank you very much.